for the anthem of the African Union. You may be seated. Honorable Mr. Ibrahim Silla, Minister of Information and Communication Infrastructure of the Republic of the Gambia. Honorable Commissioner Solomon Ayede Derso, Chairperson of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. Honorable Commissioners, members of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. Excellencies, members of the Diplomatic and Consular Corps, the Inspector General of Police of the Republic of the Gambia, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols respectfully observed. Welcome, and thank you all for coming to participate in the closing ceremony of the 65th Ordinary Session of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. I would like to present to you now the order of proceedings for this closing ceremony. We will first have the reading of the final communique of the 65th Ordinary Session to be done by Honorable Commissioner Lawrence Mute. Following that, the Chairperson of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, Honorable Commissioner Solomon Ayede Derso, will read his closing statement. We will then have a short interlude. Thereafter, Honorable Mr. Ibrahim Silla, Minister of Information and Communication Infrastructure of the Republic of the Gambia, will read his statement and declare the 65th Ordinary Session of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights officially closed. I will then make logistical announcements, following which we will have the Honorable Minister and members of the High Table, Honorable Commissioners, and all distinguished guests leave. Then that will be the end of the closing ceremony. Having said this, and with your kind permission, Honorable Chair, I would now like to call upon Honorable Commissioner Lawrence Mute to read the final communique of the 65th Ordinary Session of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights.
Final communique of the 65th Ordinary Session of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, held in Banjul, the Gambia, from the 21st October to the 10th of November 2019. The African Commission on Human and People's Rights held its 65th Ordinary Session from the 21st of October to the 10th of November 2019 in Banjul, Republic of the Gambia. The opening ceremony was graced by the presence of the Vice President of the Republic of the Gambia, Her Excellency Dr. Isatou Toure, who declared the session open. The Vice President was accompanied by a delegation which included Honorable Abubakar Tambadou, the Attorney General and Minister of Justice of the Republic of the Gambia. The Commission elected its new bureau, which shall serve for 2 years. The bureau is composed of Honorable Commissioner Solomon Ayele Derso as chairperson and Honorable Commissioner Remi Ngoi Lumbu as vice chairperson. The following members of the Commission participated in the session: Honorable Commissioner Solomon Ayele Derso, Honorable Commissioner Remi Ngoi Lumbu, Honorable Commissioner Yung Kam John Yung Sekyun, Honorable Commissioner Soyata Maiga, Honorable Commissioner Kaitesi Zainabo, Honorable Commissioner Lucy Aswagbo, Honorable Commissioner Maya Sali Fadel, Honorable Commissioner Lawrence Morogumute, Honorable Commissioner Jamesina S.C.L. King, Honorable Commissioner Hatem Asaim, and Honorable Commissioner Maria Teresa Manuela. Speaking on behalf of the NGO Steering Committee, Mrs. Hannah Foster reported that 8 country resolutions, 4 thematic resolutions, and 3 thematic recommendations were adopted during the forum. She also highlighted the following issues of concern regarding the human rights situation on the continent: violations of freedom of assembly and association, restrictions of freedom of expression and the internet, in addition to criminalization of bloggers, corruption, the systematic harassment and targeting of human rights defenders and closing of civic space, torture and the lack of access to justice for victims of torture, and overcrowding in prisons. Honorable Mwamba Mushikonke Mwamus, President of the National Human Rights Commission of the Democratic Republic of Congo, delivering a statement on behalf of the Network of African National Human Rights Institutions, lauded the entry into force of the African Continental Free Trade Area, the initiative of the Republic of Rwanda of hosting migrants from Libya, and the operationalization of the National Human Rights Commission of the Gambia. He called for effective protection of human rights defenders as stipulated in the Marrakesh Declaration, which was adopted during the 13th International Conference of the Global Alliance of NHRIs. Mr. Pacharo Kayira, the Chief State Advocate in the Ministry of Justice and Constitutional Affairs of the Republic of Malawi, representing African Union states parties, observed that great strides had been made since the birth of an independent Africa 60 or so years ago. He noted that the vision of Africa's founding fathers was not only for political independence, but also for an Africa free from poverty, disease, and non-colonialism, noting that the dream of realizing this vision was captured in Agenda 2063. Mr. Kayira concluded that the time has found Africans to decide on the kind of Africa they wanted to leave for their children and grandchildren. Mr. Eamon Gilmore, the European Union Special Representative for Human Rights, noted that, like the AU, the EU was founded to foster peace and prosperity. Mr. Gilmore noted that during the 15th AU-EU dialogue, which was held on 19 October 2019, discussions focused on the fundamental importance of a safe and enabling environment for civil society. Mr. Mahamane Siseguro, speaking on behalf of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, noted that the Commission and Office of the High Commissioner had signed a memorandum of understanding in September 2019, which formalized their long-standing partnership for the promotion and protection of human rights in Africa. He commended the declaration of 2019 as the year of refugees, returnees, and IDPs, noting that the Office of the High Commissioner would work with the Commission and the AU to find lasting solutions to forced displacement. Mr. Sekone Philip, speaking on behalf of the chairperson of the African Committee of Experts on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, reported that in spite of the entry into force of the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child in 1999, a number of AU member states had not ratified it. Further, several states had not yet submitted a report to the committee on the measures taken to implement it, and only communications had been received with 44 organizations having observer status. He concluded that next year will mark the 30th anniversary of the Children's Charter and called on all stakeholders to join the committee and the children of Africa in those celebrations. Honorable Justice Sylvain Ore, the president of the African Court on Human and People's Rights, observed that there can be no sustainable peace without justice, and without sustainable peace, development would be compromised. He reported that to strengthen the complementarity relationship between the court and the commission, both organs had established a reflection committee on the review of their respective rules of procedure. In her opening statement, the outgoing chairperson of the commission, Honorable Commissioner Soyata Maiga, noted that the commission sessions are an opportunity to assess the human rights situation on the continent. On areas of concern, she noted the pervasive instances of terrorism occurring in the Sahel countries, with the attendant loss of lives of civilians and soldiers, cases of kidnapping and destruction of property, the deplorable acts of xenophobia perpetrated against foreigners residing in South Africa, disturbing violations against children, violations committed by multinational corporations, repression of demonstrations, harmful practices and discrimination against women, and the impact of extractive industries on indigenous communities. She welcomed the initiatives made on the continent, including organization of the Grand National Dialogue to address the situation in the English-speaking regions of Cameroon, in addition to the establishment of a transitional government in the Sudan. She commended His Excellency Dr. Abiy Ahmed, Prime Minister of Ethiopia, on his award of the 2019 Nobel Peace Prize in recognition of his peace efforts with Eritrea. In closing, she observed that this was her last opportunity to address the session as the chairperson. She highlighted the achievements of the Commission during her tenure as the chairperson, including the adoption of 12 documents interpreting various rights in the African Charter. She thanked all stakeholders who had contributed to fulfillment of her mandate, in addition to the outgoing vice chairperson, members of the Commission and Secretariat who worked tirelessly alongside her to fulfill the Commission's mandate. Delivering the statement of Her Excellency Mrs. Minata Samate Sisuma, Commissioner for Political Affairs of the AU Commission, Ambassador Salah Siddiq Hamad recalled that the African continent has witnessed decades of numerous human rights challenges and noted that against this background, the AU member states of the then OAU resolved to promote and safeguard freedom, justice, equality, and human dignity in Africa by putting instruments in place to enforce these values. He called on the Commission to support the declaration of 2020 as the year of silencing the guns in Africa. Her Excellency Dr. Isatou Toure, the Vice President of the Republic of the Gambia, welcomed participants to the 65th Ordinary Session and conveyed warm greetings from His Excellency Mr. Adama Barrow, President of the Republic of the Gambia. She observed that the scourge of refugees and IDPs continued to be a great concern to all Africans. She noted that unresolved conflicts posed serious challenges for the continent and stressed the importance of addressing the deep-rooted causes of conflict in order to find durable solutions. The Vice President highlighted developments in the Gambia, such as including human rights as a priority area of the National Development Plan of 2018 to 2021, the Constitutional Review Commission, which was on track to deliver a first draft of a new constitution before the end of 2019, the recent diaspora tour conducted by the Truth, Reconciliation and Reparations Commission to engage with victims of human rights violations living outside the Gambia, the contribution of $50 million to the Victims Fund by the government, the establishment of the National Human Rights Commission in line with the principles relating to the status of national institutions, and the efforts to mainstream gender in the country's security services. She also highlighted the increase of private radio stations and newspapers, the process of drafting a Freedom of Information Bill, and recent efforts to review existing draconian media laws. Honorable Commissioner Solomon Ayele Derso and Honorable Commissioner Remingo Ilumbu presided over the deliberations during the 65th Ordinary Session in their capacities as Chairperson and Vice Chairperson of the Commission. The Commission celebrated the African Human Rights Day on 21st October 2019 under the African Union theme, Refugees, Returnees, and Internally Displaced Persons towards Sustainable Solutions to Forced Displacement in Africa. The following two panels were held as part of the celebrations. Panel on Refugees, Returnees, and Migration in Africa, Challenges and Solutions, and panel on Promotion and Protection of the Rights of Internally Displaced Persons 10 years after the adoption of the Kampala Convention. The Commission also paid tribute to the former President of the Gambia, Sir Dawda Kairaba Jawara, who passed away on the 27th of August 2019, lauding his immense contribution to the development and adoption of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. A total of 597 delegates participated in the session. These were 119 representing 31 states parties, 18 representing AU organs, 44 representing national human rights institutions, 9 representing international and intergovernmental organizations, 378 representing African and international non-governmental organizations, 10 representing other observers, and 19 representatives from the media. The Commission launched the following documents. General Comment number 5 on the African Charter on Human and People's Rights the right to freedom of movement and residence, Article 12.1. The study on conflict, addressing human rights issues in conflict situations, towards a more systematic and effective role of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. The pilot study on migration and respect for human rights. The working group on extractive industries newsletter, and the police and human rights newsletter. The following panel discussions were held during the session. Panel on reviewing the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action of 1995. Panel on enforced disappearances. The importance of civic space participation in the 2030 and 2063 agendas. Panel on the protection of human rights defenders with a focus on protection laws. Panel on the background study on extractive industries, environment, and human rights. Panel on the ratification of the protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, on the rights of older persons in Africa, and the protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights on the rights of persons with disabilities in Africa. Panel on extrajudicial killings in Africa, and panel on the implementation of Resolution 275 on protection against violence and other human rights violations against persons on the basis of their real or imputed sexual orientation or gender identity. Representatives of the following 21 states parties made statements on the human rights situation in their countries: Algeria, Angola, Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, Democratic Republic of Congo, Egypt, Eritrea, Eswatini, Gabon, Guinea-Bissau, Kenya, Lesotho, Malawi, Mali, Mauritius, Nigeria, Rwanda, Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic, South Africa, and Tanzania. Representatives of the following 10 national human rights institutions also made statements on the human rights situation in their countries: the National Human Rights Commission of Algeria, the National Commission on Human Rights of Cameroon, the National Commission for Human Rights of Mauritania, the National Commission for Human Rights of Niger, the Sahrawi National Commission for Human Rights, the National Human Rights Commission of South Sudan, the Nigeria National Human Rights Commission, the National Commission for Human Rights of the Sudan, Zimbabwe Human Rights Commission, and Commission for Gender Equality of South Africa. A total of 48 NGOs with observer status with the Commission also made statements on the human rights situation in Africa. The Commission reported on the status of its relationship and cooperation with NHRIs and NGOs, and gave an update on the status of submission of activity reports to by NHRIs and NGOs. The Commission granted observer status to 4 NGOs in accordance with the resolution on the criteria for granting and maintaining observer status to NGOs working on human and people's rights in Africa. And these NGOs were Steward Women, Trial International, Paralegal Advisory Service Institute, and Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association. This brings the total number of NGOs with observer status with the Commission to 523. The Commission gave an update on the status of submission of periodic reports by state parties. In accordance with Article 62 of the African Charter and Article 26 of the Protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights on the Rights of Women in Africa, the Commission considered the periodic reports of the following 2 states parties: combined 2nd to 9th periodic report of the Republic of Chad, 1998 to 2015. Combined 11th to 15th periodic report under the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, 2007 to 2019, and initial and combined first to fourth report under the Protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights on the Rights of Women in Africa, 2008 to 2019 of the Republic of Zimbabwe. In accordance with paragraph 25 of the African Peer Review Mechanism base document, which provides that APRA reports should be formally and publicly tabled in key regional and sub-regional structures, the Commission received the Africa Governance Report promoting African Union shared values, which was presented by the APRM Secretariat. The following members of the Commission presented their intersession reports highlighting the activities undertaken in their capacities as commissioners and mandate holders of special mechanisms. The outgoing chairperson reporting on her activities as a chairperson of the Commission. The chairperson of the Working Group on Indigenous Populations and Communities in Africa. The Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information in Africa. The Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Women in Africa. The Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders in Africa. And focal point on reprisals. The Special Rapporteur on prisons, conditions of detention, and policing in Africa. The Special Rapporteur on refugees, asylum seekers, internally displaced persons, and migrants in Africa. The Chairperson of the Working Group on Extractive Industries, Environment, and Human Rights Violations in Africa. The Chairperson of the Working Group on Death Penalty, Extrajudicial, and Arbitrary Killings in Africa. The Chairperson of the Committee for the Prevention of Torture in Africa. The Chairperson of the Committee for the Protection of the Rights of Persons living with HIV and those at risk, vulnerable to and affected by HIV. The Chairperson of the Working Group on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights in Africa. The Chairperson of the Working Group on the Rights of Older Persons and People with Disabilities in Africa. The communications, the Working Group, the Chairperson of the Working Group on Communications. The presentations of these reports generated reactions, contributions, and questions from delegates. The Commission considered and adopted the following documents with amendments. 1. Concluding observations on the periodic report of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. Concluding observations on the periodic report of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Strategy to improve the working modalities of the African Commission. Policy on internship, volunteership, research, fellowship, and secondments. Media relations and external communication policy of the African Commission. Implementation plan for the media relations and external communication strategy. Standard operating procedures for the use of online mass communication platforms by the Commission, its followers, and other users. General comment on Article 7D of the Protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights on the Rights of Women in Africa. And finally, Declaration of Principles on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information in Africa. The Commission considered the following. 1. Report on follow-up actions. Report on PANAF and regional seminar. Communications audit report. Draft concept note for the joint retreat of the Permanent Representatives Committee of the African Union and the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. Draft Annual Work Plan 2020, Standard Operating Procedures on the Establishment and Operation of Special Mechanisms of the African Commission. The Commission considered 18 communications as follows. 2 communications on the merits, of which 1 was deferred. 5 communications on admissibility, of which 4 were declared inadmissible and 1 was deferred. 6 communications on seizure, with provisional measures granted in 2 communications. 1 communication which was struck out. 1 communication whose request for withdrawal was granted. 1 update on an oral hearing which was held during the 26th extraordinary session. 1 decision on a request for recusal, and 1 decision on an application for review. The Commission adopted the following 9 resolutions. Resolution on the renewal of the ACHPR special mechanisms mandates. A resolution on the appointment of expert members of the Committee for the Prevention of Torture in Africa. A resolution on engagement of former commissioners in the work of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. A resolution on the human rights situation in the Republic of South Sudan. A resolution on the human rights situation in the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia. A resolution on the recognition, promotion, and protection of indigenous languages. A resolution on elections in Africa. A resolution on the drafting of an African declaration on the promotion of the role of human rights defenders and their protection in Africa, and resolution on the right to food and nutrition in Africa. The Commission held consultations with a delegation from the AU Advisory Board on Corruption. The Commission considered and adopted its 47th activity report, which will be submitted to the 36th ordinary session of the AU Executive Council and the 34th ordinary session of the AU Assembly of Heads of State and Government. The Commission decided to hold its 27th extraordinary session from 19 February to 4 March 2020 in Banjul, the Gambia. The Commission decided to hold its 66th ordinary session from 22nd April to 12 May 2020. The Commission extends its gratitude to His Excellency Mr. Adama Barrow, President of the Republic of the Gambia, for granting an audience to the Bureau of the Commission on Friday, the 8th November 2019, and for emphasizing his deep commitment to the construction of the headquarters of the Commission. The Commission expresses its sincere gratitude to the government and people of the Gambia for the warm welcome and hospitality extended to the participants and for creating a congenial atmosphere for the smooth conduct of its session. The closing ceremony of the 65th ordinary session took place on the 10th of November 2019 in Banjul, the Gambia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Commissioner Mute, for reading the final communique of the 65th ordinary session. It is now my honor and pleasure to call upon the chairperson of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, Honorable Commissioner Solomon Ayela Derso, to read his closing statement. Chairperson, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mari. Honorable Ibrima Sila, Minister of Information and Communication Infrastructure of the Republic of the Gambia, distinguished representatives of African Union member states, distinguished members of the diplomatic and consular corps accredited to the Republic of the Gambia, distinguished Inspector General of Police of the Gambia, distinguished representatives of national human rights institutions and non-governmental organizations, honorable colleagues, members of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, dear colleagues at the Secretariat, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon. It's my honor this afternoon to address you all, standing at the beginning of my tenure as chairperson of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. I wish to thank my colleagues for the trust that they have placed in me. While aware of the weight of this responsibility, I am confident that with the support of my Vice Chairperson, Commissioner Remy Ngoy-Lumbu, other members of the Commission, colleagues at the Secretariat, as well as all stakeholders and friends of the Commission, we will be able to deliver on the mandate entrusted to us and take the Commission to a higher place. I'd also like, at the outset, to pay tribute to the distinguished women that have held the position of chairperson before me since the beginning of my mandate as Commissioner. The outgoing chairperson, Commissioner Soyata Maiga. Her predecessor, Advocate Pansy Takula, whose leadership, together with Honorable Commissioner Lawrence Mute, has not only brought the Commission to where it is today, but also contributed in shaping my own understanding of the Commission and the role the leadership of the Commission has to play. As we conclude the 65th Ordinary Session, after 21 days of intense work, first during the public session involving all of you, representatives of states and HRIs and civil society organizations, subsequently during the closed session by the Commission, we need to take stock, particularly of what our deliberations inform us about the state of human and people's rights in our beloved continent. During the public session, the Republic of Chad and the Republic of Zimbabwe presented their periodic reports in terms of Article 62 of the African Charter, and Zimbabwe in particular, pursuant to Article 26 of the Protocol to the African Charter on Human and People's Rights on the Rights of Women, Maputo Protocol. I commend both Chad and Zimbabwe for fulfilling one of their obligations under the African Charter and the Maputo Protocol, and enabling us to engage in robust and more in-depth review of the human rights situation in these two countries. Like its other ordinary sessions, the 65th Ordinary Session provided us that unique platform where states representatives, national human rights organizations, civil society organizations, various AU bodies engage in robust debate and conversation on the state of human and people's rights, as one of the few unique platforms in the African Union where the concerns and experiences of diverse group of people from the ground are voiced. The public session allowed us to shine light on the progress being made and the pressing existing and emerging challenge in the field of human and people's rights on the continent. As a body whose primary mandate involves the promotion and protection of human and people's rights in Africa, our Commission commends and expresses its full support to the initiatives of states for the improvement of respect for human and people's rights. That is why we acknowledge with appreciation the update we received on efforts for enhancing access to social services, as highlighted by the public housing projects in Mauritania, industrialization efforts in Tanzania, and the social protection programs in Zimbabwe, among others. That is why we also express our support to the convening of elections in, among others, Mozambique, Mauritania, and Tunisia. That is why we express our recognition for the recognition through the Nobel Peace Prize awarded to Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed of Ethiopia for the rapprochement between Ethiopia and Eritrea that ended the long-standing confrontation between the two countries. That's also why we welcome the establishment of a civilian-led transitional government in Sudan, the increased representation of women in parliament in Malawi, the solidarity that Rwanda and Niger showed by receiving African migrants stranded in Libya, the release of political prisoners in Cameroon, the adoption of new laws in various countries, such as the amendment of the electoral law of Cote d'Ivoire, the Children Protection and Welfare Act, and the Human Rights Commission Amendment Act of Lesotho, and the law on human rights defenders in Mali. That is why, colleagues, we applaud efforts at enhancing the participation of women in public life, including the progressive decisions of the courts of Kenya and Tanzania on health services for reducing maternal morbidity and for upholding the minimum age for marriage at 18 years, and the review of the Marriage Act and Customary Marriage Act of Zimbabwe. That is also why we recognize as exemplary the efforts of Malawi to address the scourge of violence against persons with albinism through its National Plan of Action, and urge other states in the region to follow this example and put in place the necessary policy and legal measures for ensuring the protection of persons with albinism. Distinguished delegates, friends, ladies and gentlemen, during the public part of the session, the Commission also heard statements expressing deep concern about various existing and emerging conditions that militate against the rights of individuals and groups. These are the situations in respect of which this Commission is required by the African Charter both to express its condemnation and call on the concerned states parties to take corrective measures for ending these situations that are not in accord with the obligations they have under the African Charter. That is why we express deep concern about the dire state of the economies of Sudan and Zimbabwe and the resultant hardship that this has brought, particularly on the poor and the marginalized sections of society. That is also why the Commission deplores conditions of inequality, lack of access to social services, and socioeconomic opportunities, including jobs, that force the wretched of our continent to be in a state of adjunct poverty and the youth to flee from the continent, risking their lives. That is why this Commission condemns the governance deficits, such as corruption and abuse of state and security institutions, including the harassment of opposition politicians, journalists, and civil society activists. Distinguished delegates, it is also in full respect of its mandate that the Commission has to identify, condemn, and call for corrective action on these worrisome trends that have been observed during the intercession period, as highlighted in your statements and the activity reports of my colleagues, the members of the Commission. That's why this Commission condemns the use or weaponization of the law in various states parties to the African Charter for silencing dissent, harassing opposition party leaders or members, stifling freedom of assembly, and criminalizing human rights advocacy. The Commission is concerned about the implementation of the Cybercrimes Act in Nigeria, with journalists particularly being prosecuted. Blanket ban on protesters after the election in Zimbabwe, the use of excessive force in the context of protest, among others, in Guinea, Malawi, Sudan, and Uganda. The arrest of opposition leaders and civil society activists in context of protest, among others, in Algeria, in relation to the election slated for December 2019, and reported abductions in Zimbabwe, as highlighted by the report of Zimbabwe. That is also why the Commission expresses its concern about internet shutdown, as highlighted in Zimbabwe's state report and the statements relating to, among others, Chad and Cameroon, and in Ethiopia. The Commission wishes to inform states that the blanket shutdown of internet is excessive restriction that severely affects not only freedom of expression and access to information, but also the economic activities of small businesses, leading to socioeconomic hardship. That is also why the Commission expresses its grave concern about the human rights violations and abuses that many fellow Africans endure as a result of conflicts and crises. This is manifested in the statements, letters of concern, and resolutions that the Commission adopted in relation to the conflicts in Cameroon, South Sudan, Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and in relation to the recent spate of violence in Ethiopia. The spreading terrorist attacks and intercommunal violence in Burkina Faso, Mali, and parts of Nigeria. That's why the African Commission rejects and expresses its condemnation of illegal and unconstitutional attempts at staying in power in Guinea-Bissau and the Republic of Guinea. Also of concern for the Commission from our deliberations during the public session are challenges to the right to development, including climatic and environmental impacts, the exploitation of African people through the looting of their natural resources, and related environmental degradation, and recent major climatic events such as cyclones and flooding events in southern and eastern Africa. Distinguished delegates, I am sure you agree with me that the principles and values enshrined in the African Charter define the measure of the fairness and goodness of a society, not by how that society treats the majority, the mainstream, or the dominant sections of society, whose voices set the tone and the standard, but by how it treats the marginalized, the weak, the minorities, and those that are different from the mainstream and the majority. Similarly, the efficacy and legitimacy of the human rights system depends not merely on the protection that the system affords to the majority and the mainstream in society, but importantly, by how it lends support and affords protection to those not in the majority and mainstream of society. That's why this Commission rejects any acts of violence against women, including the use of rape and sexual violence in the context of conflict and crisis, and calls on states to take measures against all forms of violence and the patriarchal system that perpetuates violent masculinity. That is why the Commission holds that all acts of violence against persons on account of their identity, including their perceived or real sexual orientation or gender identity, is prohibited under the African Charter. That's why the Commission expresses its condemnation of the abuse and violation of the bodies and liberty of migrants, asylum seekers, and refugees in Libya, the plight of Mauritanian refugees in Senegal, and Sahrawi refugees in Algeria, who continue to live in a gray area between those having the protection of nationality and statehood and those without. That's why the Commission deplores the xenophobic attacks in South Africa, the reported mass expulsion or forced repatriation of refugees from Nigeria, Tanzania, and Botswana. And that's why the Commission condemns in the strongest terms possible violence against persons with disabilities, particularly the continuing killings and maiming of persons with albinism. Distinguished delegates, colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen, before I conclude, I wish to turn to the functioning and operations of the African Commission as an area of concern. In this respect, I would like to highlight the following areas that will receive particular attention in the coming 2 years. The African Commission, the premier human rights body of the African Union system, is constituted to carry out its functions free from all sources of undue influence, irrespective of their sources. Its independence is the cornerstone of its mandate, that it should safeguard not only from political actors such as state parties, but also others, including partners and non-state actors. That's why the Commission will continue to standardize and streamline relationship with all its stakeholders as a means of consolidating its independence and enabling it to implement its priorities effectively. The Commission will prioritize the securing of concrete plans with the required resources for the construction of the headquarters of the African Commission in the Gambia. To this end, to have a joint strategy with the government of the Gambia. In this context, I would like to express my deep appreciation to His Excellency President Adama Barrow. I would like Minister to convey this message to him for the firm assurance that he has given our Commission that the construction of the headquarters of the Commission is a priority of his administration, which he gave when he received us on the 8th of November. The Commission is further dedicated to enhancing knowledge and understanding about the Commission among the wider African public, including through improved communication of the work of the Commission to wider stakeholders, and by working together with those that the Commission would recognize as friends, champions, and ambassadors of its mandate and its work. The Commission also takes seriously the concern expressed by various stakeholders in relation to its protection mandate, in particular in relation to the communications procedure. Addressing the Commission's backlog and implementation of decisions is a key priority for us. Measures have already been instituted to ensure that there is greater balance between the protection and promotion mandates of the Commission, in particular in the finalization of decisions on merits. The Commission expresses with grave concern the serious capacity deficiencies that continue to plague its Secretariat. Myself, together with the Vice Chairperson and other members of the Commission, will do everything possible to resolve this deplorable capacity deficiency of the Commission. The Commission expresses its appreciation to all the state delegations which express their commitment to working in cooperation with the African Commission. We take note of the call from states parties to the African Charter for the need for more consultation and engagement with the states. And we commit to deepening our relationship with key stakeholders of the Commission and elevate it to a higher strategic level. And finally, the Commission will pay particular attention to a number of emerging thematic areas with which it hadn't previously engaged systematically, including, among others, the impact of climate emergency and the right to development. Distinguished delegates, I may not conclude without making reference to some of the outcomes of the private session of this 65th ordinary session, which I urge all of you to consult and make good use of. These notably include the General Comment number 5 on the African Charter on the right of freedom of movement and residence in Africa, the study of the Commission addressing human rights issues in conflict situations, and the General Comment on the Maputo Protocol. This session wouldn't have delivered on what the Commission sets out to accomplish without the participation of all delegates who joined us in this beautiful city of Banjul. I wish, therefore, to thank you tremendously for your active engagement during the public session and your continued interest in the work of and your collaboration with our Commission. The human rights enterprise founded on the African Charter and the role of our Commission depends on your continued support and collaboration. I therefore call on you to continue your active engagement and support in full respect of the independence of the Commission. I also wish to thank the government and the people of the Gambia for hosting yet again another successful session and for the facility that they provided us. We look forward to take our working relationship to a higher and strategic level for enabling the Commission to deliver on its mandate and the Gambia to fulfill its role as host of the Commission and its potential to be the human rights capital of Africa. I would like to thank all the technicians, interpreters, translators who have facilitated this session so well. Last but not least, I can't thank enough the Commission's Vice Chairperson, my colleagues, members of the Commission, and our own heroes, heroines and heroes, the staff of the Secretariat. Asante, thank you, shukran.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chairperson. Thank you very much, the Gambia Police Band. It is now my singular honor and privilege to call upon Honorable Ibrahim Asila, Minister of Information and Communication Infrastructure of the Republic of the Gambia, to deliver his statement and declare the 65th Ordinary Session of the African Commission officially closed. Honorable Minister, you have the floor.
Madam Chairperson, thank you so much. Honorable Chairperson and members of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, Commissioners of the African Commission, Excellencies, members of the Diplomatic and Consular Corps, the Inspector General of Police, distinguished delegates from the member states, distinguished representatives of the national human rights institutions present here, distinguished representatives of non-governmental organizations, members of the press, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I have to say that it is indeed a great pleasure to be here with you today to address such a distinguished gathering of state delegates, members of the international community, and experts in the fight for human rights. On behalf of His Excellency Mr. Adama Barrow, President of the Republic of the Gambia, the government and people of the Gambia, I wish to extend our warmest felicitations to all the participants for a very fruitful and successful 65th session of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. I would like to thank the African Commission for hosting yet another successful session in the Gambia, the home to the Commission. The Gambia, as you all are aware, has a special affinity to the Commission, not only because of its hosting, but also given the pioneering role of the country's first president played in the establishment of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. It is therefore fitting that at this opening session, a special tribute was paid to the late Sadauda Kairaba Jawara for the role he played in the promotion and advancement of human and people's rights on the African continent. Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I would also like, on behalf of the government and people of the Gambia, as well as all other human rights defenders on the continent, to express our sincere thanks and appreciation to the erstwhile chairperson of the African Commission, Her Excellency, Madame Soyata Maiga. Madame Maiga has spent more than 12 years of her life in the Commission working for human rights within the African continent. As the Special Rapporteur for Women, she held this portfolio with distinction and commitment dedicated towards lifting the human rights situation of the girl child and women in Africa. She is indeed and has been characterized as the champion of the women's rights on the African continent. We thank you all, Madam Maiga, and we are proud of you. I would also like to thank the outgoing Vice Chairman, Commissioner Mute, and all other outgoing commissioners for their service in making the Commission what it is today. We in the Gambia will particularly reminisce Madam Maiga's presence in our country as chairperson of the African Commission, as it was during her tenure in office that dictatorship came to an end on the soil of the Gambia. I take this opportunity to thank her most profoundly for her commitment, steadfastness, and the sterling qualities of leadership that she exhibited during her tenure in office. I wish her a very successful journey and God's blessing and guidance henceforth. To the new chairperson of the Commission, Mr. Dasso, I would like to congratulate you, sir, on your commitment and your appointment, and I extend a very warm welcome to you. In the same vein, I would also like to assure you of our government's full cooperation and support in the realization of the aims and objectives of the African Commission. As always, These sessions give us the opportunity to evaluate and monitor the situation of human rights on the African continent. The theme for this year's session, refugees, returnees, and internally displaced persons towards the durable solution for forced displacement in Africa, is absolutely critical given the problems encountered on the continent with regards to refugees and internally displaced persons. Notwithstanding the 1969 OAU Convention governing the specific aspects of refugees in Africa and the Kampala Convention of 2012 on the protection and assistance of internally displaced persons in East Africa, more needs to be done on our continent, not only to review and modernize these legislative frameworks, but also to commit more resources for their implementation. I must, however, take this opportunity to implore the member states that have not done so to ratify the 2012 African Union Convention for the protection and assistance of internally displaced persons, because only 40 member states have signed so far, and just only over half have ratified the convention. The African Union has declared 2019 as the year of refugees and internally displaced persons towards durable solution for forced displaced in Africa. We must therefore, as member states, give effect and meaning to this declaration and not allow it to remain merely as a lofty declaration. Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, we should avert our minds that the African Union in July 2016 declared the years 2017 to 2027 as years of human and people's rights decade in Africa. In arriving at this decision, a decisive step was taken to develop a 10-year human rights action and implementation action plan to concretize the declaration. This laudable declaration manifests our heightened sensitivity to the priorities for the promotion, protection, and fulfillment of human rights on the continent. It is indeed my estimation that this is a gigantic step to gravitate from rhetoric to real meaningful action. Notwithstanding the positive developments on human rights on our continent, we still continue to encounter ugly challenges in the forms of terrorism, piracy, sexual and gender-based violence, suppression of the rights to free expression and assembly, and other forms of natural calamities on our continent. The recent attacks on the Meneka camp in Mali, resulting to the death of over 49 persons, as well as other terrorist attacks in Burkina Faso a couple of days ago, must be condemned. And we stand in solidarity with the African Commission for its stance on such unlawful acts on the continent. The situation in South Sudan remains fragile, and everything possible must be done to make sure that the state does not relapse into conflict. Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, as we work towards the realization of Agenda 2063, which is an endogenous plan for the transformation of the African continent, learning from past and present African development challenges, as well as forging an African-centered approach to transformation, we must commit and rededicate ourselves towards meeting the aspirations that we have set for ourselves, namely growth and sustainable development, political unity good governance and respect for human and people's rights, a peaceful Africa with a strong cultural identity whose development is people-centered and people-driven, and an Africa as a strong, united, resilient, and influential global player and partner. Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, let me also take this opportunity to particularly thank the Secretariat headed by Ms. Marie Saint-Fridaus and all our team for the wonderful organization of this year's session and for making everyone's stay here in Banjul a memorable one. Let me also thank the translators and the interpreters for a job well done. We're proud of you and thank you for this wonderful job that you have done for the Commission and the session this year. Finally, Mr. Chairperson, ladies and gentlemen, I wish you all a safe journey to your respective destinations. And it is my honor now and pleasure to declare the 65th session of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights officially closed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister, for that powerful closing statement. Thank you very much, the Gambia Police Band, once again. And thank you very much, everyone that is here. That brings us to the end of the closing ceremony of the 65th Ordinary Session of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. May I now ask everyone here to please remain seated to allow the Honorable Minister, the Chairperson of the African Commission and the Vice Chairperson, Honorable Commissioners and Excellencies, distinguished guests, to take their leave first before they depart. Thank you, all of you, for coming. Merci beaucoup. Muito obrigado. Jere len jëf. Ala baraka. Jarama buy.